music stopped at exactly 11:42 p.m. Duke Ellington's fingers froze over the piano keys when Sal Torino grabbed the microphone and told 300 people that no jungle music was playing in his club anymore. 3 seconds later, I was standing behind Sal with my straight razor pressed against his throat. By morning, every mobster in New York knew the same lesson: disrespect Duke Ellington in Harlem. And you answer to me. I am Ellsworth Johnson, but the streets call me Bumpy. This is the night I taught the Italian mob that some things in Harlem are sacred. The 15th of August, 1947, the Lenox Lounge was packed wall to wall. Duke Ellington was headlining, and when Duke played in Harlem, it wasn't just music, it was church. It was pride. It was everything we had built in this neighborhood, when the whole world told us we didn't matter. This wasn't just any musician. This was the man who'd taken jazz from speakeasies to concert halls, who'd proven that black music was high art when white critics still called it noise. Duke had played for kings and presidents while most of our people couldn't even vote. He was our ambassador to a world that didn't want to hear our voices. I was at my corner table watching the room, protecting what needed protecting. Duke was in the middle of Caravan, his fingers dancing across the keys like he was painting music in the air. The whole club was hypnotized. Rich folks from downtown mixing with Harlem regulars. Everyone united by the genius flowing from that piano. That is when Sal Torino walked in with his crew. Torino was connected to the Genovese family, a thick-necked enforcer who collected debts and broke legs for Vincent, the Chin Gigante. Sal had been trying to muscle into Harlem's entertainment business for months, claiming the Italians deserved a piece of every club, every show, every dollar that moved through black hands. He'd already tried strong, arming 3 smaller clubs on 125th Street, demanding weekly tribute for protection. 2 paid up out of fear. The third owner, an elderly man named Roosevelt Williams, refused to pay. They found Roosevelt in the hospital with 2 broken arms and a message: pay or close. He'd approached me twice before. Both times I told him the same thing: Harlem isn't for sale. But Sal Torino didn't listen well, and tonight he was about to learn why that was a fatal mistake. He pushed through the crowd, his 3 bodyguards following, making noise, disrupting the sacred atmosphere Duke had created. People turned, annoyed, but when they saw the guns bulging under those cheap suits, they looked away quick. You could feel the temperature in the room change, like a storm moving in conversations. Died mid-sentence. Waiters stopped serving. Even the cigarette smoke seemed to hang heavier in the air. Sal walked straight to the stage, his footsteps echoing against the sudden silence. Duke never stopped playing, but his eyes tracked the movement. He knew trouble when he saw it, had probably seen it coming from the moment those cheap suits walked through the door. I stood up from my table. My hand moved to the razor in my jacket pocket. I'd carried that razor since 1935, and it had taught manners to more men than I could count. Sal reached the microphone. He grabbed it right out of the stand while Duke was still playing. The music jarred, stopped, died. 300 people turned to stare. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," Sal announced, his voice cutting through the silence like broken glass. "There has been a change in programming tonight." Duke's hands were still positioned over the keys, but he wasn't playing. He was waiting, watching, probably wondering if this was how his career ended. "See, this establishment is now under new management," Sal continued, grinning like he owned the world, "and we don't feature jungle music in respectable venues." The room went dead silent. Jungle music. He'd called Duke Ellington's genius jungle music. I started moving through the crowd, slow, deliberate, my eyes locked on Sal's thick neck. Some insults you ignore, some disrespect you negotiate. But when someone calls Duke Ellington's music jungle music in front of 300 Harlem residents, that is not business anymore, that is war. From now on, Sal was still talking, still grinning. "This club features real American music, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Perry Como, music for civilized people." He looked directly at Duke. "So pack up your bongos or whatever you call them, boy, and get off my stage." Boy, he'd called Duke Ellington boy. I was 10 feet behind him now. Sal's bodyguards were scanning the crowd, but they were looking for trouble from the front. From the sides, they weren't watching their boss's back because nobody in that room looked dangerous to them. They were wrong. Duke started to stand up from the piano bench. His face was calm, professional, but I could see the humiliation in his eyes. This man had played for presidents, had revolutionized American music, had brought dignity to our people through pure artistic genius. And some too. Bit Italian thug was calling him boy in his own neighborhood. Not on my watch. I pulled out my razor. The blade caught the stage lights as I unfolded it. 3 inches of steel that had carved respect into more faces than Sal could imagine. The sound it made unfolding was barely a whisper, but in that silent room, it might as well have been thunder. I'd carried this razor for 12 years, and it had never failed to teach the lessons that words couldn't. "Excuse me," I said quietly, pressing the blade against Sal's throat. He froze. His bodyguards spun around, hands reaching for their guns, but I pressed the razor deeper into Sal's skin, just enough to draw a thin line of blood. "Move and your boss bleeds out on Duke's stage," I told them. Sal's voice came out in a whisper. "You are making a mistake, Johnson." "No," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. The mistake was thinking you could walk into Harlem and disrespect royalty. I looked out at the crowd, 300 faces staring at us, witnessing history. Women in evening gowns, men in their finest suits, musicians who'd traveled from across the city to hear Duke play. All of them watching as I held a razor to the throat of a man who thought he could steal their dignity. Some faces showed fear, others showed satisfaction, but every single person in that room understood what was happening. This wasn't just about music. This was about respect, about who belonged in Harlem and who didn't, about protecting the things that made us who we were. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "let me introduce you to Sal Torino. He just told you that Duke Ellington's music isn't good enough for this room. He called our greatest artist boy." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Angry murmurs. I pressed the razor a little deeper. Another thin line of blood appeared on Sal's neck. "Now, Sal here is going to apologize to Duke," I continued. "Then he is going to ask Duke very politely to continue playing, and then Sal is going to sit in the back corner, shut his mouth, and learn about real music." Sal's bodyguards were sweating, hands still hovering near their weapons, but they couldn't move, not without getting their boss's throat opened. "Apologize," I whispered in Sal's ear. I apologize," Sal stammered. "To Duke," I clarified. Sal turned toward the piano. "Mr. Ellington, I apologize." Duke was still standing, still maintaining that professional dignity that made him untouchable. He'd faced racism his whole life, from concert halls that wouldn't book him to hotels that wouldn't house him. But he'd never let it break his composure, never let them see him sweat. Tonight was no different, even with a mobster bleeding on his stage. "Apology accepted," he said simply, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd earned his place in history. "Now ask him to continue," I prompted. Would you please continue playing?" Duke sat back down at the piano. Of course, his fingers found the keys, and Caravan started up exactly where it had been interrupted. I kept the razor at Sal's throat through the entire next song. I could feel him trembling, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of fear, sweat. His bodyguards stood frozen like statues, hands still hovering near their guns, but afraid to move. Let him feel it. Let him understand that his life was in my hands for the next 4 minutes while Duke played. Let him learn respect the hard way. When the song ended, I finally spoke again. "You and your boys are going to walk out of here quietly. You are going to go back to Gigante and tell him Harlem's entertainment district is off limits. You are going to explain that Duke Ellington is protected in this neighborhood, and anyone who disrespects him answers to me." I folded the razor but kept it visible. "And Sal, if I ever see you in Harlem again, if I ever hear about you bothering any of our artists, any of our clubs, any of our people, I won't stop at your throat next time." Sal nodded quickly, blood still trickling down his neck, staining his white shirt collar. "Now get out of my neighborhood." Sal and his crew backed toward the exit, hands visible, eyes down. The crowd parted to let them through, and when the door closed behind them, the room erupted in applause. Duke started playing again, and this time it was take 5. The music washed over the room like healing water, erasing the poison Sal had brought into our sanctuary. I walked back to my table, ordered a bourbon, and watched Duke work his magic. This was what I protected. This was why I carried that razor. Not for money, not for territory, but for moments like this when genius needed defending and respect required enforcement. Word spread through the underworld by morning. But more importantly, it spread through Harlem's streets by noon. Kids playing on stoops heard the story from their mothers. Shopkeepers told customers while counting change. Preachers mentioned it in Sunday sermons, though they didn't approve of the methods. The story grew with each telling, but the message stayed the same. Harlem protected its own. The Italian families got the message loud and clear. Harlem's culture was untouchable. Duke Ellington was untouchable, and anyone who forgot that lesson would deal with Bumpy Johnson's razor. Sal Torino never showed his face in Harlem again. His boss, Vincent Gigante, sent word through intermediaries that there had been a misunderstanding, that the families had no interest in Harlem's entertainment business. The truth was simpler. They'd learned what every smart criminal in New York already knew. Some things are worth more than money. Some people deserve more than respect. They deserve protection. And in Harlem, when those principles were threatened, I was there with 3 inches of steel to restore the balance. But this went deeper than just protecting one man, even a man as great as Duke. This was about preserving what little we had built in a world determined to tear it down. Every time someone like Sal walked into our neighborhood thinking they could take what was ours, they weren't just stealing money. They were stealing hope, stealing pride, stealing the very soul of Harlem. That is why the razor came out so fast. That is why there was no negotiation, no compromise. Some battles you can't afford to lose because losing them means losing everything. Duke played at the Lenox Lounge for 6 more years after that night. Every time he took the stage, I made sure he was protected. Word spread through the jazz community about what happened, about how Harlem stood up for its artists. Musicians started coming to our neighborhood, knowing they were safe, knowing their art was respected. Because that is what kings do for other kings. That is what Harlem does for genius. And that is what a man with a razor does when the world tries to silence greatness. They called Duke Ellington the king of jazz. But that night, I made sure everyone knew that in Harlem, kings protect kings.